Today, we're going to be discussing with the folks who ran the conference about some of the key outcomes and takeaways from the conversations that took place there. So without further ado, on my left is Adam Levine, who is a professor of emergency medicine and health services for policy and practice, and a director for the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. And on Adam's left is Alexandria Nyland, who is a research associate for the CivMil program at the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. And for our colleague who is joining us virtually, Jonathan Robinson, who is a contracted humanitarian specialist supporting the U.S. Naval War College's Humanitarian Response Program. Thanks, folks, for being here. And today, the agenda is going to be a short presentation from Alex and Johnny, just outlining the research symposium's outcomes, but also the workshop's outcomes from the conference, and then we'll move into a moderated discussion. So Alex, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Well, first I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. The Watson Institute Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies and the U.S. Naval War College's Humanitarian Response Program, with support from OCHA and UNWFP, brought over 100 individuals from the civilian military humanitarian response community to Providence, Rhode Island, May 22nd through 24th. For those 3 days, the mix of humanitarians, U.S. and international military members, emergency responders, and academics met to discuss some of the most pressing challenges and questions plaguing CivMil relations today during a research symposium and a 2-day workshop. To our knowledge, this is the biggest solely civil military humanitarian coordination focused event in the world. My colleague, Johnny Robinson from HRP, will tell you a bit about the workshop. This morning, I'm happy to share some of the exciting outputs of the research symposium. This was our 4th and largest symposium, featuring both depth and breadth in terms of CivMil topics discussed. The goal of the CivMil Research Symposium is to both highlight as well as inspire empirical studies that can provide critical evidence base that might inform practice and increase the efficacy of life-saving emergency responses. For the first time, we held 3 simultaneous panels for a total of 10 research presentations. We also hosted the inaugural research poster presentation, which gave attendees the opportunity to engage with one another on their research in a more casual manner. All 10 of the presentations are currently available to view on CHRHS's website. Topics ranged from mapping different nations' approaches to CivMil coordination, to CivMil interactions during pandemic responses, to CivMil coordination during climate-induced emergencies, to the U.S. evacuation of Afghanistan in 2021. For the sake of time today, I am going to briefly highlight the research on the evacuation of Afghanistan, but I am happy to follow up on any of the other topics. A key goal of the CHRHS CivMil program is to make our evidence-based academic work practical and user-friendly. This is especially true in the case of this current research project I will discuss, which aims to have programmatic, policy, and academic relevance. The evacuation of more than 100,000 Afghan citizens from Kabul last year was the largest humanitarian evacuation in recent memory. It's vital that we learn about the successes and failures of this evacuation from the perspective of the Afghan evacuees themselves in order to improve similar humanitarian evacuations in the future, as well as aid in the smooth resettlement of these individuals. One of the key goals of this project was to document the experiences working in Afghanistan with the U.S. military or government partners, as well as their experiences of the U.S. evacuation and resettlement operations. This project draws on 32 in-depth interviews with Afghan evacuees who experienced both Operation Allies Refuge, so the airlift operation, and Operation Allies Welcome, the resettlement operation in the U.S. And this subset of the population were resettled in Providence, Rhode Island. The sample that we used is representative of the three broad categories of evacuees, so special immigrant visa SIV holders, SIV eligible parolees, and non-SIV eligible parolees. Themes around family were the largest cluster by far, with topics of separation, ongoing financial obligations, and concerns over physical safety of loved ones. A key theme to arise across almost every interview was family separation. Interviewees reported being separated from their families in a variety of ways. Some described being separated at the Kabul airport, while others left their home for the Kabul airport by themselves. Another key theme was the chaos and uncertainty at the Kabul airport. Nearly every interviewee described a traumatic experience of the evacuation, both in terms of how they learned of their eligibility for evacuation and the actual airlift operation at the Kabul airport. Interestingly, once the evacuees made it into the U.S. and arrived at the safe haven bases, the majority of those we spoke with described more positive experiences. The report that this presentation was based on puts forth 8 actionable recommendations, such as the need to address the disparities in which populations are eligible for evacuation and ways in which to involve the displaced populations awaiting resettlement in decision-making processes in order to give them more agency. Zooming back out to the wider symposium, this last recommendation connects to a common key finding across almost all of the research projects: the need for localization in responses to emergencies of all kinds. Getting a diverse swath of the affected population involved in the response not only creates a more inclusive operation, but also has shown to increase the efficacy on metrics along things such as community trust. For example, a presentation on infectious disease responses showed that the operation was able to be more successful in terms of disseminating information and gaining community trust much faster when they engaged a local network of mothers. I am going to close by saying every academic's favorite phrase. This is an empirical question that needs more research, and I'm looking forward to seeing a whole new batch of scientific studies on these topics emerge and hopefully be presented at our next symposium. I will now hand it over to Johnny, who can tell us more about the following 2 days of this event. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. I think I can hear you. I'm having troubles with sound on my end, so I haven't been able to hear the first part. But like many of you here, I'll have to start with a disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed here are very much my own views and not any of my current or former employers, such as US Naval War College, Department of Defense, NetSimCo. They're very much my own personal observations. Continuing where Alexandria left off, I hope, the 2 days after the research symposium focused on a workshop to bring discussions to a more practical level. Several forums were used to explore the theme of this year's event, planning considerations for humanitarian access and response during the era of strategic competition and growing climate change. These forums included a keynote panel, specialized working groups on aid workers' security, climate change, humanitarian access, outbreaks, as well as protection of civilians. 4 cross-cutting theme groups were also used to focus on civilian-military interaction in urban environments, hunger as a weapon of war, private militaries and security companies, and maritime humanitarian response. The aim of these sessions was to encourage military and civilian attendees to identify challenges and opportunities in humanitarian military interaction for future crises, be it large-scale conflict during the era of strategic competition or the growing climate crisis. Towards the end of the event, these different groups came back together and a series of straw poll questions were asked to survey and summarize participant experience, as well as encourage further thought and discussion. So some of these outputs I'm going to share with you now, which hopefully will help form our discussion this morning. So one of the first questions we asked aimed to gauge what issues participants felt were important to consider for future civilian military humanitarian interaction. And as you can see from the word cloud generated from those responses, that interactive survey, trust, coordination, communication, and relationships were some of the most regularly mentioned issues by all different types of participants, and really shows that both sides, both military and humanitarian, want those things and work hard to develop those things. The next question we asked participants was, what was their perception of civilian military interactions and if they were improving in environmental disasters at the top there and conflict settings at the bottom. As you can see from the results, participants from both military and civilian backgrounds pretty much agreed that civilian military interactions in environmental disasters were on the improving end of the scale. In conflict settings, however, most answered that they felt this interaction was towards the not improving end of things. And so a simple poll like this can perhaps show where work needs to be done in the future. Another interesting question we asked was what keeps people up at night regarding the future of humanitarian and military interaction. Now, we got lots of individual answers, and so we grouped these into 4 areas that were commonly said throughout. And so the first being failure to reach people in need due to a lack of resources, a very vast and real threat considering that over 100 million people will not have their needs met this year, according to the UN Global Humanitarian Overview of 2022. The next area was a loss of communication and cooperation between armed actors and humanitarian actors, highlighting the fragility that perhaps some participants feel with that relationship, cooperation, trust, things like this. And indeed, this is a real concern in a future conflict, given the increasing trend of attacks against aid workers in the world, and that future conflicts could involve assertive states such as Russia or the People's Republic of China, who typically do not connect with the wider humanitarian community at present. The next area was a loss of distinction between military and humanitarian actions, was also raised as a concern in the era of increasing politicization of aid. A growing number of militaries have been involved in direct assistance. This includes assertive states like Russia or the People's Republic of China, whose militaries often lead their humanitarian response capabilities and whose civilian humanitarian ecosystem often blur the line of what is military support and what is humanitarian support. This is also a phenomenon that we've seen with grassroots activist organizations in places like Syria and Ukraine as well. The final point was that although many humanitarian responses are largely reactive, participants felt there was a lack of preparedness for the impact of strategic competition and large-scale combat operations, in particular around protection of civilians, the overwhelming of the humanitarian response system and civil-military relations, as well as humanitarians being manipulated by military actors during the conflict. And then the final survey question that I'm going to share with you today was a more constructive question about what, depending on your perspective, what could the other side, a civilian or a military actor, do to make things easier in the future? And so, again, I grouped answers together. And so answers common to both military and civilian participants included more proactive communication to understand abilities and culture, but also, crucially, political and operational constraints. This is not always widely understood. Reciprocal information sharing was also mentioned as an area to explore. And in particular, from the military side, often it's talked about information sharing, but for example, in humanitarian notification systems for deconfliction, quite often that information is transferred in one direction rather than shared reciprocally between militaries and humanitarians. And one participant mentioned shifting the culture from a need to know culture towards a need to share culture. And then increasing both military and humanitarian involvement in training exercises and education was also highlighted as an area to explore, such as humanitarians being invited to military exercises more and militaries being invited to humanitarian training that I know USAID, UN OCHA and the World Food Programme have been spearheading, for example. Using scenario-based exercises and tabletop simulations was also mentioned as an area to explore. But I could go on, but I want to make sure we have enough time to discuss things this morning, so I'll bring this to a close. But please be on the lookout for our future annual event, our 8th annual event next year. It really is a unique forum that has been created that brings military and humanitarian practitioners together to explore areas of connection. Thank you, and over to you, Jude.
Thanks so much, folks. I do want to underscore the importance of this work just because the conflict landscape is changing and getting more complex. And at least from the humanitarian side, humanitarian organizations are expected to respond in evolving environments that have de facto authorities, multiple parties to a conflict, climate change, a rise of gender-based violence. And also, they're expected to do that with a widening humanitarian funding gap. So they also need to focus more on how to diversify their funding while they are responding. And it's a difficult task that humanitarian organizations have not necessarily needed to do before. So this type of coordination is important to talk about, and I personally extremely value the conference that all of you held. So moving into questions, I am curious, Adam, we haven't heard from you yet, to know a little bit more about the working groups that took place at the conference, because initially, I will think about coordination and I'll only think about how we work with each other, but there's different types of ways to work with each other, and these things already exist. So I know Johnny named like outbreaks, climate change, protection, access, aid worker security, and I was wondering if you could highlight the potential for CivMil humanitarian coordination across these sectors, and if you could explain which intersection is currently witnessing the most progress, and maybe what that progress looks like.
Yeah. So, as Johnny mentioned, one of the areas where CivMil coordination is probably strongest and most developed over the last 30 years is in the acute onset natural disaster. An earthquake happens, a hurricane happens, and both military and humanitarian actors respond. And while it's not perfect, I think that is probably the area where humanitarians and military are most comfortable working together. So our workshop has 5 working groups that do not focus on that area. They focus on all of the more problematic spaces in which militaries and humanitarians work. As was mentioned, we have working groups on outbreaks, climate change, humanitarian access, protection of civilians, and aid worker security. All of these areas are important. None of them are perfect in terms of the progress that's been made. But interestingly enough, I would say from my own personal observations that we've made the most progress, perhaps not surprisingly, on issues related to outbreaks and climate change. So I think the COVID-19 pandemic really spurred all of us to think about how we use militaries during public health emergencies, during pandemics and epidemics. And in fact, according to a recent article published by Erickson et al., more than 95% of the countries on Earth use their militaries in some way to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, including us here in the United States as well. And as a result of that, there have been a lot of interest in developing new guidance and new research into how this works. We have a report that just came out around CivMil coordination in the US during the COVID-19 pandemic. The World Health Organization just published new guidelines on national CivMil health collaboration for strengthening health emergency preparedness, which focuses on how countries use their own militaries to respond to pandemics within their own borders. And then the World Health Organization Emergency Medical Team which deals with international health responses, also just developed a CivMil technical working group to help inform their work, of which we're part and really excited to develop. In addition, our outbreak working group at our workshop has been developing new practical recommendations on how to apply the Oslo guidelines, the traditional guidelines for CivMil coordination in disasters, to a public health emergency like COVID or the next COVID. Similarly, with climate change and coastal resilience, we've seen quite a bit of progress from militaries. I mean, we had the recent DoD climate risk analysis in 2021 and the climate adaptation progress report in 2022. And I would actually state that in some ways the military is ahead of the humanitarian community in thinking about the impact of climate and what it means in terms of adjusting operations and planning for the future. So we've certainly seen progress there. With regards to protection of civilians, it's been a bit more of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it was exciting to see the Civilian Harm Mitigation Response Action Plan by the U.S. Department of Defense that was published last year, also known as the CHIMRAP, which really creates a roadmap for how the U.S. military at least is going to take into account protection of civilians across the board in all of its military planning. But at the same time, we see many ongoing conflicts from Ukraine to Syria where we have direct targeting of civilians, and so there's still obviously a lot of progress that needs to happen. Finally, with humanitarian access and aid worker security, we're clearly seeing backsliding in both of these areas, and this is where we need a lot more attention. We have places like Tigray, where recently assertive governments have limited humanitarian access and now apparently have siphoned off humanitarian assistance and food assistance for military purposes, which is a huge issue. And then other places like Haiti, where a conglomeration of criminal gangs is preventing access of food aid, and the humanitarian community simply doesn't know how to deal with this new type of actor. It's not a non-state armed group that hopes to rule territory one day and wants to look good to the international community. These are criminal gangs that are blocking access, and we have precious little data on how humanitarians can work with these in order to ensure access to the communities that need them. In aid worker security, well, numbers of aid workers killed, kidnapped, or harmed is just going up year after year. And this is a huge area where we need more focus, especially around things like humanitarian notification systems, which are still in many ways in their infancy and need a lot more work.
Thank you. I appreciate the challenges because that is where a lot of conversations need to take place, right? And one of the biggest conversations that I've been noticing between these two sectors is the conversation about fundamental core humanitarian principles and the way that we respond. Because at the end of the day, although it seems like we have the same goal, our agendas are very different. And one of the contentious points in that conversation is humanitarian principles, humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and also independence. And purist humanitarian organizations define independence as not aligning with a state or its agenda. And Johnny, I know you're doing a lot of work on this and also spoke about this at the conference. I'm interested in your perspective or insight about whether the United States and humanitarian organizations should in some way reconcile this definition and understanding for U.S. CivMil humanitarian coordination, specifically in the context of large-scale conflict, I think, considering that the military is an arm of the state advancing state interest while providing assistance. Would really appreciate any thoughts that you may have on that.
Thanks, Jude. Yeah, and I'll definitely answer from my own personal perspective rather than the United States as a whole. But yeah, I mean, certainly the culture in humanitarian and military kind of action that has been as a result of the humanitarian principles is a key difference. I think the likes of Ukraine and Syria has seen an alignment perhaps of the military and humanitarians seeming like they have the same goal or they're supporting the same sides. But when you look at the nature of the humanitarian principles and the humanitarian sector in general, it was set up in a direct reaction to military action. The Battle of Solferino in 1859, was just truly, truly awful, that, it resulted in the Red Cross being formed and eventually the Humanitarian Principles being formed. And so these principles are a fundamental difference between humanitarians and militaries. And I think certainly we've seen a testing of these limits in places like Syria with assertive states, as well, testing these principles. And certainly in the future, I think, in future conflicts, potentially also involving assertive states, might test these principles further. But I do think there's a lot of commonality between humanitarians and militaries that can be leveraged to work together, not necessarily collaborate, not necessarily be connected, but at least supporting that unity of effort together towards a common goal. And I think that's a key area to explore. And so, I'll maybe stop there, but just start with that with an opening salvo. Thanks.
Thanks, Johnny. No, I appreciate it. It's a contentious conversation, as we experienced at the conference, but also in the humanitarian sector as well. We talk about coordination so frequently, and how we can have better interagency coordination, and how we can coordinate also with local actors. It's a conversation, and it's one that we need to have. So I appreciate your insights, and I'm going to turn back to you about it later. But we'll stop there with you. Another part of the conference that I thought was extremely interesting was taking a step back from the CivMil engagement and focusing more on mil-mil engagement and what that specifically looks like. And Alexandria, I know that you're paying closer attention to this. My question for you is, in recent discourse, there's been an emphasis on mil-mil engagement in humanitarian settings and conflict settings. And have there been any recent successful instances of mil-mil engagement alleviating a humanitarian crisis? And if not, are there any potential benefits that maybe folks have been talking about in the case that there is an increase of mil-mil engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think really important in terms of looking at the variety of actors that operate in these situations. So one area that we haven't talked about yet that we looked into in the workshop was our side sessions. So we took time aside from the working groups to have cross-cutting theme sessions that focused specifically on issues that cut across the themes of these working groups, and to bring the individuals from the working groups into a session so that they can kind of collaborate on some of the toughest issues in the CivMil world. So one of these topics was private militaries and security companies, PMSCs. And I think that that's perhaps one of the more, well, at least to me, one of the more interesting topics that we can look at. I'll kind of zoom out from mil-mil to military and security actors is kind of the language that we like to use. So I think the presence of PMSCs in these conflict settings, so we can look at, of course, the Wagner Group, but we can also look at other types of private military and security companies that are contracted in these areas. And the questions remain, like how to interact with these groups, if they can be, if it's a net. I think that the broad understanding is that they're not a net benefit to the situation, but in the cross-cutting theme session, the PMSC session, we also wanted to discuss, as you mentioned, like the tougher, more controversial stances, like could these groups be engaged in a way that could potentially help humanitarian interventions? And of course, that was extremely contentious, and we, of course, did not come to an answer in the short amount of time that we had, but I think we have to ask ourselves these really tough questions. If we can engage with these in the community, if these new types of actors in the security space can be engaged with. For example, to open up access was one of the topics that we were discussing.
Great, thank you. I think let's start putting it into context, right? So we're talking about these really big ideas, and I think it'd be helpful to maybe get insights from Johnny and Adam, if you want to hop in, by all means, on Russia's war in Ukraine. So let's talk about our preparedness, our adaptive planning, and crisis response in this context specifically. And I know it's underscored the importance of preparedness in large-scale combat and conflict. And my question is, how can intentional civ-mil or mil-mil humanitarian coordination help mitigate the worst outcomes while adhering to core humanitarian principles? Are there or were there in the current conflict any compromises that have been made that you know of? Johnny, how about we start with you?
Wow, yeah, definitely a good question. Certainly, when you look at Ukraine, and it's not just Ukraine, but Syria saw it, and other places are seeing it. The rise in grassroots humanitarian organizations at the local or national level, and certainly testing the principles of neutrality in particular, that when your world is being completely erased, you can't be neutral. We've seen that in Syria as well, and other places. And so I think certainly a challenge that I saw, before the second invasion of Ukraine, was that, I don't think the international humanitarian community in particular had come to reckoning with that, and that difference. There was still a push on neutrality, and you can only be a good humanitarian if you're neutral, and this kind of stuff, and it's really testing that. And then in addition to that, we've seen on the other side, Russia develop a relatively large humanitarian response and ecosystem. There's around 23 humanitarian non-governmental organizations, as it were, although they do still have very strong links with the state. So it's hard to say they're fully NGOs. Respond to eastern occupied areas of Ukraine, in addition to different state entities, military entities, the Ministry of Emergency Situations and the Ministry of Defense. And so, they're often not necessarily forgotten, but by design, they exclude themselves from the wider humanitarian community. And so I think, that's certainly on the research that I've been looking at. That's been happening since the early 2000s, and so it's only becoming apparent now that there is that one side versus another side, and so where does the engagement start? And that's a hard question given Russia's actions in Syria and Ukraine and elsewhere, but also could lead to the People's Republic of China for the future. Where is the engagement and the preparedness there? And then also non-state armed groups. We haven't talked about non-state armed groups yet, or even the private sector as well, both of which also have influenced that civ-mil space as well. But yeah, I'll stop there. Maybe let Adam finish anything I perhaps have forgotten.
Yeah, I would agree with what Johnny has said. I think that Ukraine especially demonstrates the lack of advanced planning and preparedness, not just military, but humanitarian as well. It's important to note that most of the guidelines around civil-military coordination have been drawn up in the past 30 years during the post-Cold War era, when conflicts and complex emergencies were largely about intrastate conflict, civil wars, etc. Now, as we see sort of this resurgence of great power conflict and interstate war, as we have in Ukraine, people could argue we already had in Yemen and in Syria, it raises sort of deeper questions around how civ-mil coordination should work when one of the governments that is providing the majority of funding for the humanitarian organizations working in that context is also the government providing the majority of funding for the military that is going on in that country, or the military campaigns that are going on in that country. It not only compromises this idea of independence, but also certainly around neutrality. I do want to point out, though, that I think neutrality as a humanitarian principle is misinterpreted by a lot of individuals. We have to recognize that humans are not neutral, and we never have been neutral. When I was working with International Medical Corps, for instance, in Libya during the civil war in 2011, I didn't meet a single Libyan who was neutral about Gaddafi, including the 90% of our staff working for the humanitarian organization that were Libyan. However, the question was not whether the individuals working with us were neutral, but whether our organization could set up protocols that made our actions neutral. So for instance, when we were running sort of a field hospital near the front line, could we set up medical protocols to ensure that everyone, regardless if you were a combatant on either side or a civilian, got treated in the order of your medical need and not based on your representation and so forth. And so I think that continues to be the important lesson, whether it's a local organization or an international organization. We shouldn't be asking the individuals working to be neutral. We should be asking them to set up protocols of neutrality. Now, in Ukraine, that itself is even being tested because many of the local organizations really have no interest in setting up protocols that ensure neutrality in their work. But many do, and I think that we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We should accept the fact that nothing is going to be perfect, and the more organizations we can get to adopt these protocols of neutrality, even if some are not, that probably that doesn't mean that the entire humanitarian principle of neutrality is compromised in that setting just because a few of the actors working in that setting are not applying it. But certainly, I think as a humanitarian community, we can do much more to be proactive in thinking about how we apply these principles in this new realm of great power conflict, and also how we think about civil-military coordination in this new world of great power conflict.
Yeah, that puts it into context a little bit more. And I really like the point that both of you pointed out regarding training guidelines and protocols, because maybe that's where we can start with a lot of these conversations. And I think they are starting there, right? When we're in the CivMil space, people are talking about, what does this mean? How can we advance humanitarian principles in our response, but also in coordination with the military? And I know there are trainings that exist in the EU, but also in some parts of the US military to highlight those principles in trainings, but we want to scale that up. We want to make sure that we're on the same page and have a similar understanding of what response means, especially if we're using the words humanitarian assistance. So Alexandria, I would be interested if you could touch a little bit more on guidelines, syllabi for humanitarian assistance for US military training missions, and maybe what that looks like and how we can scale that up further, and how we can also make sure to outline international humanitarian law in those guidelines.
Yeah, and also I just wanted to add to the discussion that just happened previous to that question about kind of the potential consequences of not of this kind of blurring of lines, when, especially in Ukraine, when there's like a rhetorical, like good side and bad side, and then when the humanitarian community is kind of painted with the broad brush stroke of being the Western group, that creates consequences for aid worker security, which Johnny is an expert on. And so I just wanted to jump in that many of the humanitarian attendees at the conference had discussed concerns about increased targeting, kind of when the humanitarians are co-opted into one side in a large-scale conflict. And then in terms of the question you just posed to me, I'd like to kind of go back to the presentation or the research that I discussed in the presentation, so the Afghan evacuation. I can use that kind of as an example. So, and specifically the resettlement in the US. So in the presentation at the research symposium, we had an individual join us who from the U.S. military side who had helped set up one of the safe haven bases in the U.S. that the Afghan evacuees stayed at until they were processed and sent onward for resettlement. And his observations were that they were literally building from nothing in the desert, starting from zero and building up. And he compared that kind of to the U.S. military, or at least in this case, his experience with building up the relations with the NGO sector and the nonprofit sector and government sector in these areas, and the kind of idea of last resort, and that using the military is meant to be a last resort. And the argument, or the position that really comes out in the report, is that we can't wait until the last minute to start building up these connections that can really create a more fluid operation. So such as the building a safe haven base to accept thousands of evacuees essentially on a moment's notice, that prior training and socialization events really help to build that familiarity with very different operating procedures. And in that research project, we found that the actors in the response didn't understand the capacity, or weren't fully aware of the capacity and the operating procedures of the other actors. So, and they didn't know what they were allowed to do and what they weren't allowed to do. So this is a tricky case because it was the U.S. military on domestic soil. And so there was a little bit of misalignment in understandings between the civilians and the military on like what each could do. So one of the recommendations in the report is then to just do more socializing events, if only to share information on each group's capacity and what can be expected of them in order to make it for a smoother operation.
That's very much like what the conference is for, in order to like have that gathering and bring people together to have those conversations. And I think I was most surprised by that in a pleasant way, to be invited in conversations that I had no idea about with military actors. Like, I don't know all the lingo to have certain conversations, but there was a lot of meeting each other in the middle, which was great. And that was extremely comforting coming from maybe a humanitarian background in order to have that conversation. And it was vice versa, which is something I appreciated so much. And you're touching on challenges and opportunities. And Adam, did you have something to add?
I was just going to agree. I think, that's one of the big purposes of our workshop. Of course, it's there to think big thoughts and come up with policy changes and develop new research, but it's also there at a very basic level to have, somebody from a big humanitarian NGO sitting next to somebody from the U.S. Marines so that they get a chance to actually talk to each other and get to know each other as humans.
Yeah, and folks are welcoming. It was a good experience for me. Alexandria, I want to go back to something that you had mentioned about how humanitarian attendees were expressing their concerns at the conference, and build a little bit more about what those specific concerns were. And Johnny, if you could also hop in at the tail end of Alexandria's question, that would be helpful.
So just so I understand the question, what were some of the key concerns expressed by humanitarians? Yeah, there were a few. So in terms of the theme of the workshop, if we go back to the question about strategic competition and adaptive planning, I think one of the key concerns was, and speaking on behalf of, the group is always a little problematic, but to summarize, lack of preparation, and also just being able to know, again, going back, being able to know what each actor's capabilities are, and being able to know who to call, for example, that basic of a situation, who to call when there's a specific emergency, or what the person of contact and stuff like that is actually something that can be solved through workshops like this, where you kind of get to know the command structures, you get to know like what each agency is capable of doing. I think Johnny probably has a bit more to add on to that, if you can hear me.
Yes, yeah.
No,
thanks, Ali. Yeah, just to add on, I think certainly one thing two things that stood out to me certainly were the understanding the constraints of each other, because I think, some of the complexities of modern complex emergencies, for example, they can be governed by counterterrorism legislation. They also have sanctions and other things like that added to them. Plus, military objectives might not align with humanitarian objectives. It might not be prioritized. The counterterrorism legislation might be prioritized above that, and then also the fractured responses that, for example, the US AID could be based in Istanbul, but most of the humanitarians going into Syria, northeast Syria, are based in Duhok and Erbil. So kind of differences and kind of disconnects there, and then certainly just the unknown from both sides of who to call, from the military participants, seeing, Doctors Without Borders, for example, as this big entity that, who do you call, who's the focal point in that kind of organization, and then vice versa as well from the humanitarians. The military is this big, box of just the military. And so if you've got an issue, who do you call there, and who's the touch points there? And I know that there are kind of connections with, UN Civil Military Coordination officers, SimCord officers, humanitarian military interaction officers in the World Food Programme, and other kind of interlocutors, but it isn't always known. So I think kind of better understanding on both sides from those two things would be valuable for sure.
Thanks so much, Johnny.
Could I add one more?
Absolutely.
So another kind of meta issue that I noticed was a common thread throughout conversations was funding, which you opened up with. With all of these problems and complexities multiplying, funding is drying up, and the need to diversify funding was certainly a key concern that obviously could not be answered in 3 days.
Hampers a lot of humanitarian access and the way that they provide assistance through principled operations, and that is being challenged by traditional donors, and we do need to diversify our funding. But we're in Washington, D.C., where a lot of those conversations happen, not just here, but other parts of the world as well. This is one key part, and I want to move to Adam, to one of our last questions before we open up to audience Q&A. We could probably take 1 or 2 questions. Adam, what areas do you think tankers and policymakers and even the academy should be paying attention to create better safeguards, better policies within the realm of the CivMil space?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and obviously there's a lot of ways to answer that, but from my academic hat, I'll answer it this way. So the National Institutes of Health has been spending the past decades pushing billions of dollars towards this broad area called translational research, which is research that brings treatments from the laboratory, from the bench, to the bedside so that they can actually help real patients in the real world. And I think that in the CivMil community, we also need an influx of attention towards translational research. We need to find a way to bridge theory and practice to bring together civilian, military, and academics to design empiric studies that help us understand how CivMil works in the real world in a variety of contexts, and how we can actually ensure that the CivMil coordination works across the world for the beneficiaries that we are trying to protect and trying to serve. Right now, we have a lot of good ideas, but we have very few empiric studies that help us make that bridge. I'm not suggesting billions of dollars are needed here. Millions would be great, but certainly research in this area needs to be a greater focus of attention.
And what's one key area of research that you think we should be paying attention to specifically?
I think we need more research on the perspectives of affected populations. Most, and we don't have much, but most of the empiric research we do have in this area looks at the perspectives of humanitarians, the perspectives of military, but very little of it actually looks at what those individuals in communities on the ground in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe, what they think about receiving aid from militaries, what they think about ideas of neutrality, what they think about how humanitarians treat them and provide them with aid. And that sort of information will really help us contextualize and bring sort of the core concepts of CivMil coordination into practice in these different areas in a way that brings local communities into the decision making.
Yeah. And I mean that's the total definition of CivMil coordination. Right now we're talking about the humanitarian aspect, but we also need to be inviting and welcoming to the opinions and ideas and insights of local actors themselves who are affected by conflict and how they feel about engaging with a variety of groups. So completely agree. Let's go ahead and open it up to our audience. I think we'll have a time for 1 or 2 questions. We have our colleague Luke who will go ahead and run the mic if anyone would like to ask anything to our panelists today.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. Have you been able to use the internet in helping in your effort to get these operations going?
I'll start and then maybe Alexandria could add in. We certainly have been using the internet in a variety of ways. I mean, one of the things that's really exciting about a lot of the research we're doing is that it's very global in nature, and we have global fellows actually from our Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies based all over the world, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, and all of them are directly engaged in the design of our research studies and carrying it out. And so, especially during the pandemic, we carried out a large-scale study that involved 175 interviews in DR Congo, Syria, and the Philippines in the midst of a pandemic. And the way we did that was really through our local partners and essentially entirely coordinating with them virtually, which actually worked out quite well. Of course, we also use the internet to try and disseminate a lot of our work, our research, and our reports. I don't know if you want to give other perspectives.
Sure. Not to harp on the pandemic, but the research project that you just mentioned was also interrupted by COVID. So it wasn't originally designed to be so virtual and online. So we had fieldwork planned in each country, and then obviously that became impossible. So then we very quickly learned, kind of built the plane as we were flying it in terms of connecting with our local partners and doing it virtually. Another important way that we use the internet and social media is, again, disseminating our research findings, but also events. So again, the pandemic, as evidenced by this hybrid event, the pandemic has really challenged us, but I think in a good way, to think about how to get folks to engage with our research through events. So previously in true university form, most of our events were in person, but now we're rethinking how, not only because people are more used to hybrid events, but also the benefits of it. So for example, increasing participation, increasing diversity. Not everyone can, for example, fly to Providence, Rhode Island to attend a research symposium, but a lot of people can tune in online to a live stream and ask questions. And I think that's great because it connects back to this theme of trying to increase participation and ownership.
And I just want to add one thing from the user experience, engaging with the War College's Humanitarian Response Program, but also Brown, is that they have research portals that they are building and adding to very consistently to make sure that all work is up to date. And that's something that I personally use and appreciate. And I know a lot of other folks like the Global Fellows, but also people throughout the sectors do engage with those. I know, Johnny, you made one at the Humanitarian Response Program specifically for CivMil Humanitarian Coordination, and that was extremely valuable for folks. Thank you for your question. Is there another question that we have? I think we have time for one more. Okay.
Hi. I thought it was really interesting what you were talking about, just the social aspects and the information that we get when civil military organizations and humanitarians just talk more and interact more. What's the #1 area that we can all work together on?
Let's start with Johnny.
Yeah, I think Johnny. He looks eager.
No, that's great. Yeah, #1. Wow. I think for me, it's the training and education. The Naval War College's Humanitarian Response Program. We already have various forums which we do education. And I know World Food Programme, you and OCHA as well have also developed their own humanitarian training as USAID. So, I think really widening that and encouraging that can be a great area, and recognizing, where to put resources for that, where to understand, the perceptions. For example, the Defense Support Civil Authorities, DSCA, is a humanitarian focused action in the domestic space. You've got security cooperation partnerships, which also include humanitarian assistance training exercises with partners and allies. And so really understanding where to best utilize that training and education, and support that training and education with the right authorities and the right support. So I'll start off there, and hopefully Alexandra and Adam have thought of an answer now.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to second that training and education, but kind of build on it as well. So the month before our workshop was UNOCHA's Humanitarian Networks and Partnerships Weeks in Geneva. And one of the themes that really threaded through was a connecting thread between HNPW and our workshop was the desire for more CivMil trainings and education and socialization events. So the desire was there, and in the metrics that Johnny shared earlier, one of the questions we asked was, do you think that trainings can increase efficacy, and basically, would you like to engage in these trainings? And it was almost a no-brainer question where it was 98% yes, but then the problem comes in funding these opportunities. So again, not to go back to funding, but there's a big will for these training programs, for individuals to attend these training programs, but perhaps a lack of funding for people to attend these trainings within organizations. So, yeah.
And I would just add there that, there's a lot of different ways to do trainings, and they're all very important. But I think one of the areas that we should probably be working on building the most is simulation-based training. The U.S. military calls these war games, which tend to turn off the humanitarians, so we need a different name for them. But simulation-based training has the benefit of teaching people in a setting where they're actually getting to practice their real-world skills, so people remember it more. But it also has the benefit of giving you the opportunity to socialize humanitarians and military actors together in the same setting as they work together on a simulated humanitarian emergency, or don't work together, depending on what the simulation is being drawn up as to teach. And there's a lot of great examples of this already happening, but we could use way more, and way more of them not just hosted in the US or Europe, but also hosted across the global South.
I think that rounds out our conversation about opportunities and challenges. And there's so much space for growth and conversation, but the one thing that we need above all else is that actual space where we can hold those conversations and simulations and the other things that we had mentioned. And we especially need to do this in the context, again, of large-scale conflict and combat operations. The landscape is changing, and we need to be able to respond to it in a way that is principled and ethical, but also informed about each other's operations. Contentious, but a conversation to have. And on behalf of CSIS Humanitarian Agenda, thank you so much for joining us today.